There is a mountain in western New South Wales that does not look like a mountain. It looks like a pyramid. Not approximately. Not in the way that many rocky hills are sometimes fancifully described as pyramid-shaped by people who have a loose relationship with geometry. Mount Zeil in the Northern Territory, Mount Cunerin in Queensland, Frenchman's Cap in Tasmania, there are many Australian peaks that carry informal references to their angular profiles. But the formation in the Darling Ranges of far western New South Wales, known locally as the Glass Mountain and documented in 19th century survey records as one of the more geometrically anomalous landforms in the state, is different in ways that have attracted scientific attention since European surveyors first mapped it in the 1860s. The four faces of this formation are not approximate. They are close enough to planar, close enough to oriented in specific compass directions, and close enough to meeting at a defined apex that the surveyors who first mapped it noted its regularity in their field records with the kind of language that suggests they were aware they were describing something unusual. And when geologists began studying this formation with the tools that modern science provides, what they found in the rock of this mountain, beneath its surface, and in the electromagnetic and acoustic properties of the structure as a whole, did not make the anomaly easier to explain. It made it harder. This is the account of what the research has found, and what it means for understanding the deep geological and possibly human history of this part of the continent. If you are new here, this channel covers Australian history, science, and country that most people were never properly taught. Subscribe now and let me know in the comments below whether you had ever heard of this formation before watching this video today. Let us start with the geology, because the geological context of this formation is, before you add any anomaly to it, one of the more interesting in western New South Wales. The Darling Ranges of far western New South Wales sit on the western edge of the Lachlan Fold Belt, the same ancient geological province that produced the granite of the Snowy Mountains and the complex deep crustal structure that recent surveys have revealed beneath southeastern Australia. The rock in this part of the state is old. Very old. The basement here is Precambrian in age, predating the Cambrian explosion of complex life, placing the formation of the underlying rock at more than 500 million years ago and in some units significantly older than that. The specific rock type that forms the core of the anomalous formation is a quartzite, a metamorphic rock produced when sandstone is subjected to the heat and pressure of burial and tectonic deformation, recrystallizing its quartz grains into a dense, hard, nearly insoluble mass that is among the most resistant rock types to surface weathering on the planet. Quartzite outcrops persist in the landscape long after the softer surrounding rock has been eroded away, which is why prominent quartzite formations are often geomorphologically isolated features standing above the surrounding terrain. This is part of the explanation for the prominence of the formation in question. It is standing because the rock around it has been reduced by erosion over hundreds of millions of years while the quartzite itself has resisted. But erosion resistance alone does not explain regularity of form. Quartzite outcrops across Australia and globally produce irregular, angular ridges, blocky masses, and jagged summits. The regularity of the four-face structure of this formation, the near-planar faces, the defined apex, the compass orientation of the faces, these are not features that erosion of quartzite typically produces. The geological assessment of this regularity, conducted by researchers from the University of New South Wales and the Geological Survey of New South Wales in a series of studies beginning in the 1980s and continuing through the 2000s, documented what the fieldwork established. The formation's four faces correspond to four major joint sets in the quartzite. Joints are planar fractures in rock along which no displacement has occurred, produced by the release of stress within the rock mass during cooling or during changes in the pressure conditions it has experienced. The joint sets in the quartzite of this formation are oriented in four directions that, in combination, produce the four-face geometry of the surface when differential weathering preferentially removes material along the joint planes. This explanation is geologically standard. Joint-controlled topography is well documented at many sites globally. Differential erosion along joint planes produces angular landforms whose geometry reflects the geometry of the joint sets in the underlying rock. What the UNSW research found, however, was that the joint sets in this formation are unusually regular in their spacing and orientation relative to joint systems found in comparable quartzite bodies elsewhere in the region. The typical quartzite outcrop has joint systems that are irregular in spacing and that show variation in orientation across the body of the rock, reflecting the complex stress history of a rock mass that has experienced multiple episodes of deformation over its geological history. The joint systems in this formation are more regular, more evenly spaced, more consistently oriented than would be expected from a rock body with the complex geological history that the surrounding region's rock record documents. The geological assessment does not describe this regularity as impossible to explain through natural processes. It describes it as at the extreme end of what natural processes produce, and as warranting further investigation of the stress history of the rock mass that produced it. That further investigation has been ongoing, and its results have been progressively surprising. Now let us talk about the electromagnetic properties, because this is where the research produced findings that were not anticipated from the geological assessment. Magnetometric surveys of the formation and its immediate surroundings, conducted as part of regional mineral exploration surveys in the 1990s and in a more targeted survey of the formation specifically in 2004, documented that the quartzite of this formation carries an unusual magnetic signature relative to the surrounding geology. Quartzite is typically magnetically quiet. The recrystallization of quartz that produces quartzite from sandstone eliminates most of the magnetic minerals that produce magnetic signatures in the original sedimentary rock. A quartzite body in the middle of a magnetometric survey usually appears as a low-signal zone, a magnetically quiet region surrounded by the more magnetically complex response of the surrounding geology. The quartzite of this formation is not magnetically quiet. The magnetometric surveys documented an anomalous magnetic response from within the formation that is not consistent with pure quartzite composition. The magnetic signature suggests the presence of magnetite-bearing material within the body of the formation, in a distribution that the surface geology, which shows no outcrop of magnetite-bearing rock on the formation's faces, does not explain. The magnetic material appears to be in the interior of the formation, not at the surface. Ground-penetrating radar surveys conducted in 2006 as a follow-up to the magnetometric findings produced additional anomalous results. The radar returns from the interior of the formation, at depths ranging from 5 to 15 meters below the surface, show a pattern of reflections that the survey team described in their report as inconsistent with a homogeneous quartzite body. There are internal boundaries within the formation that produce radar reflections, indicating material contrasts at depth that are not apparent from the surface geology. The interpretation of these internal boundaries in the radar data is not straightforward. Internal layering in metamorphic rock is common and expected. The metamorphism that produced the quartzite from the original sandstone typically preserves and emphasizes the original sedimentary bedding, creating compositional layering that would produce radar reflections. This is the standard interpretation. What the survey team noted in their report as requiring further investigation was the geometry of the internal boundaries. In a standard metamorphic quartzite, the internal layering would be expected to parallel the external surfaces of the formation, reflecting the orientation of the original sedimentary beds that were metamorphosed to produce the rock. The internal boundaries documented by the radar survey in this formation do not consistently parallel the external surfaces. Some of them have orientations that cross-cut the expected bedding orientation in ways that suggest either complex structural disruption of the original layering or the presence of internal features of a different origin. The survey team's report, which was produced as an internal document for the mineral exploration company that funded the work and which was subsequently made available to researchers at the Geological Survey of New South Wales, recommended further investigation using seismic methods to characterize the internal structure at greater depth. That seismic investigation has not been conducted. The mineral exploration company that funded the original surveys found no evidence of economically significant mineral deposits in the formation and withdrew from the project. The internal survey report passed into the files of the Geological Survey and has been cited in 2 subsequent academic papers that addressed the broader question of unusual quartzite formations in the Lachlan Fold Belt, without the specific anomalous findings from this formation receiving detailed discussion in either paper. Now let us talk about the acoustic properties. Because the findings from acoustic investigation of the formation added a dimension to the scientific picture that neither the geological nor the electromagnetic research had prepared the researchers for. The acoustic investigation of the formation was not conducted by geophysicists. It was conducted by a team of archaeoacousticians, researchers who study the acoustic properties of ancient sites and their relationships to human use and cultural significance, who became aware of the formation through a paper in a regional geological journal and visited the site in 2011. Archaeoacoustics is a relatively young discipline whose application to Australian sites has been limited but productive. The same principles that have been applied to understand the acoustic design of European prehistoric sites such as Stonehenge and the painted caves of the Dordogne have been applied to a small number of Australian rock art sites and stone arrangements, producing findings about the relationship between acoustic properties and the placement of cultural material that are consistent with deliberate exploitation of sound in ways that go beyond simple aesthetic preference. The Archaeoacoustic Survey of the formation documented that the four faces of the formation produce distinct acoustic effects relative to the surrounding landscape. Sound produced near the base of each face reflects and focuses in ways that create measurable standing wave patterns at specific positions in front of each face. These positions, where the acoustic field produced by reflection from the rock surface constructively interferes with the direct sound field, are locations where sound of specific frequencies is amplified relative to the ambient acoustic environment. The frequencies at which the amplification occurs are in the range of human voice and of the percussion instruments used in Australian Aboriginal ceremonial contexts. This finding was the one that the archaeoacoustic team regarded as most significant, not because it confirmed deliberate acoustic design, which it does not establish and which may not be applicable to a natural geological formation, but because it identified this formation as a location where the natural acoustic properties of the rock surface create conditions that would have been perceptible to any group of people who spent time near it, and that would have been experienced as acoustically unusual relative to the surrounding landscape. People are sensitive to acoustic environments. This sensitivity is not a modern development. It is a fundamental feature of human perception that predates any specific cultural framework. A location where sound behaves differently, where the human voice reflects back with unusual clarity, where percussion produces resonances not present elsewhere in the surrounding terrain, is a location that human beings notice. It is a location that tends to accumulate cultural significance in societies that spend extended time in its vicinity. The question of whether the Barkandji and Wangkumara peoples, whose traditional country encompasses the formation and surrounding region, assigned cultural significance to this location is one that the archaeoacoustic team raised in their published paper and that they noted required engagement with traditional knowledge holders to address properly. That engagement has been partially conducted. Researchers working with Barkandji knowledge holders in the period since the Archaeoacoustic Survey have documented that the formation is known in Barkandji tradition by a name that translates approximately as the place that speaks, and that it is associated in traditional knowledge with specific protocols of approach and use that distinguish it from the treatment of ordinary landscape features. The place that speaks. Documented in traditional knowledge. Confirmed by acoustic measurement to have anomalous sound properties relative to the surrounding landscape. This is the same correspondence that appears at Uluru, at the Blue Mountains, at the Snowy Mountains, at every Australian site where the effort has been made to bring traditional knowledge into dialogue with scientific investigation. The traditional knowledge is accurate. The instruments confirm what the knowledge describes. Now let us talk about what the formation looked like to the first people who saw it. Because the human history of this part of New South Wales extends back to the earliest period of human presence in the continent, and the formation's visual character would have made it significant to any group moving through this landscape from the beginning of that history. The formation is visible from a significant distance across the flat terrain of western New South Wales. In a landscape that is predominantly flat to gently undulating, a prominent four-sided peak visible from 30 to 40 kilometers in favorable conditions is a navigational landmark of the first importance. It is the kind of feature that is used to orient movement across country, that is referenced in descriptions of routes and locations, and that accumulates in the knowledge systems of people who move through a landscape the cultural weight of long use as a reference point. Optically stimulated luminescence dating of sediment from a rock shelter located within 2 kilometers of the formation's base, excavated by a team from the Australian National University in 2009, has produced dates for the earliest cultural material in the shelter extending back approximately 45,000 years. 45,000 years of human presence within 2 kilometers of this formation. The archaeological material from the shelter, stone tools, charcoal from hearths, ochre fragments, documents continuous or near-continuous use of this location across that entire span. The formation visible from the shelter entrance throughout that entire period. A landmark that the people using this shelter would have seen every day of their occupation of the site. What they understood about the formation and what role it played in their knowledge of the landscape and in their cultural practice is encoded in the oral traditions and knowledge systems of the Barkandji and Wangkumara peoples whose ancestors occupied this country. Those knowledge systems describe the formation as significant in ways that the research has not yet fully documented in collaboration with traditional knowledge holders. What has been documented is that the formation is not treated as an ordinary landscape feature. It has a name. It has associated protocols. It is a place that speaks. And it has been known as all of these things for longer than any record outside traditional knowledge extends. Now let us bring the full picture together. A quartzite formation in far western New South Wales with 4 near-planar faces oriented in specific compass directions, produced by an unusually regular joint system whose regularity sits at the extreme end of what natural geological processes typically produce. Carrying an anomalous magnetic signature that indicates the presence of magnetite-bearing material in its interior not apparent from the surface geology. Showing internal structure in ground-penetrating radar surveys whose geometry does not fully conform to the expected pattern of metamorphic layering. Producing acoustic effects on each of its 4 faces that create standing wave amplification at frequencies consistent with human voice and ceremonial percussion. Known in the traditional knowledge of the Barkandji and Wangkumara peoples as a place that speaks. Located 2 kilometers from a rock shelter with 45,000 years of documented human occupation. None of these findings individually constitutes proof of anything beyond a geologically interesting quartzite formation that happens to have unusual properties across several measurable dimensions. Together, they constitute a profile that no other known natural formation in New South Wales has produced. The geological explanation for the formation's regularity is available but sits at the limits of what natural processes typically produce. The electromagnetic and structural anomalies in the interior are documented but unexplained. The acoustic properties are measurable and confirmed. The traditional knowledge is accurate about the acoustic character of the site. And the archaeological record documents human presence in the immediate vicinity across a time period that extends to the founding of human occupation in this part of the continent. What additional investigation of this formation would find, using the seismic methods that the 2006 ground-penetrating radar survey recommended and that have not been conducted, is not currently known. The mineral exploration company that funded the first surveys found nothing of commercial value and moved on. The academic papers that have touched on the formation's anomalous properties have not generated the level of sustained research attention that the combined profile of findings would seem to warrant. The formation sits in the landscape of far western New South Wales, visible from the flat plain around it for 30 kilometers in every direction, as it has been for every one of the 45,000 years that people have been living near it. It is still speaking. The question of what it is saying has not yet been fully answered. If this changed how you think about Australia's ancient landscape, leave a comment below and subscribe for more Australian history and science that most people were never properly taught.